What sculptures, almost 2,500 years after they were made, inspire impassioned rhetoric and international claims? What inspired the Romantic poet Lord Byron to pen fervent verse when he became infuriated over their removal? And what iconic architecture inspired a pop artist of the 1960s? The Parthenon and its sculptures is the answer. Look at this. This print was made in 1964 and couldn't be more minimal in evoking the idea of a classical temple, and yet you probably know right away what it is. These forms seem so timeless to us, so familiar. Even in their most fragmentary form, they call to mind associations of epic order, stability, and glory of the past. But the source of inspiration, the Parthenon, was strikingly new and innovative when it was built. Its magnificent sculptures exhibit a fascinating, changing style, more sensuous and realistic than what came before. In Greece, we'll see, there's a much more rapid transition to a natural approach to movement and the human body than we've seen so far in either Mesopotamia or Egypt. So now we're going to look closely at a few examples of superlative sculpture from the Parthenon. The Parthenon is the greatest iconic symbol of classical Greece. It reminds us that power is fleeting. Ancient Greek power in Athens was at its height when the Parthenon was built, but its ruined state today is sad to see. The temple was built between 447 and 432 BC as a testament to the glory and pride of the Athenian polis, or state. It replaced an earlier temple that had been destroyed by the Persians in 480 BC, and it announced the comeback of the Athenians in the wake of that defeat. The Parthenon proclaimed the greatness of Athens, and it was here, at the pinnacle of the Acropolis, that you could once find some of the greatest art ever created. The ruins of this temple of Athena Parthenos, the Virgin Goddess, still stand proudly on the Acropolis, but much of the most treasured sculpture was wrested from its perch and taken to foreign museums. Some of the best sculpture, about half of what survived the millennia, went to the British Museum, thanks to Lord Elgin in 1801. The British Museum is now home to what we call the Elgin marbles, or Parthenon marbles. Greece is currently, in 2012, angry and clamoring to get those sculptures back, though, and it has built a museum to house them. It stands partly empty at the base of the hill of the Acropolis. Lord Byron was outraged by this plunder. In his poem, The Curse of Minerva, written in 1811, Byron shamed Elgin with these lines: "Sacred to gods, but not secure from man, the past returned, the present seemed to cease, and glory knew no clime beyond her Greece. Frown not on England, England owns him not. Athena, know, thy plunderer was a Scot." Perhaps the Greek Museum will get the marbles back, but why exactly are they so intent on getting them back? Let's look at the marble sculpture and see why. Classical Greek sculpture seems almost humdrum to us today because it's endlessly reproduced and it's rarely explained or put in context. You've just seen the amazing development of sculpture from the archaic times in Greece to a point of coming alive, newly realistic portrayals of men, especially athletes. This happened in a very short time. There's this really dramatic break with prior tradition in Greece happening in the 5th century BC, from one of restraint and stillness in life-size sculpture to depictions of action. When we look at the heyday of classical art, which is usually dated from 480 BC to 323 BC, we have battles, emotions, galloping horses, and raging centaurs. Now, I'd like to show you some of the most compelling masterpieces of sculpture, the highlight tour of the Parthenon. So first, a glimpse of Alma Tadema, the Victorian painter's 1868 version of what my professor David Mitten called opening night at the Parthenon. The painting is actually called Phidias, showing the frieze of the Parthenon to his friends. Phidias is the master sculptor, and his admiring friends here appear to include Pericles, the leader of Athens, and Socrates. Note that the frieze is painted, as the sculptures were known to be, but probably not in those colors. Let's isolate some of these examples of sculpture from the Parthenon and see what makes it so memorable. We'll start with two metopes, a few pediment sculptures, and the frieze of the Parthenon, which are sublime. I'm confining our discussion to just these few pieces, even though it's hard to restrain one's enthusiasm, because the riches of the Parthenon are embarrassingly great. But I would like you to be able to see them in a little more depth rather than fleetingly. I'm particularly fond of one of the metopes that shows a lapith versus centaur battle. So what is a metope? It was part of the relief sculpture that's integral to the architecture of the Parthenon. It was high up here on the outside and probably was made first, since they built the temple from the outside in. Structural support came first. The Parthenon was a very complex building, and a Doric temple, which is the first of the three orders or styles of Greek temples. The building itself is not just a pure rectangular block, it was jiggered with alterations and curvatures. It had what we call optical refinements, essentially optical illusions like the curving base of the building, which made it look like it was hugging the earth. The Doric columns swell in their middles, and that curvature makes them seem both more human and correct in their form. These optical refinements were said to create the most perfect building ever built by man. In addition, the sheer number of sculptures that were part of the building was new and astonishing. The newest twist in tradition was a unified program of sculptures created under the direction of Phidias, the artist, that were mind-blowingly intricate and expensive to create. The sculptures had tales to tell, usually told with gods and mythical characters, including centaurs. The elaborately carved metopes were created just for this building and had different themes for each side of the building. Metopes are conceived a bit like paintings, but in relief. They're square expanses of marble high up on the exterior walls of the temple. Each metope was separated from the others by triglyphs. Triglyphs are just those three grooves you see between the metope sculptures. Some people think that they imitate wood that originally might have held up the roof. There were 92 of the metopes, more than any previous Greek temple. Here's my favorite metope. It's sophisticated, vital, dramatic, and elegant, all at once. It also shows us what's brilliant about classical art. How? We have here a mythical battle between a centaur and a lapith, and you can see the tension that pulls the two figures apart at the same time that they fight each other. Who are these characters? The story of this myth goes something like this. Lapiths were a very ancient mythological Greek race, ancient even to the citizens of Athens at that time. They were celebrating the wedding of the king's son, according to the story, and very generously they invited the creatures who lived in the forest nearby, centaurs. That turned out to be not such a great idea. The centaurs, half man, half horse, could be real beasts, crude and badly behaved. They got very drunk at the wedding and gave in to their basest impulses. Centaurs started to make off with the lapith women and try to rape them, so the lapiths naturally responded by fighting them. This was a popular scene for art from the earliest periods of Greek art and into the Renaissance. You can even see it on a wedding chest of the 1500s, although you have to wonder why the artist chose this debacle, a rape scene, for a wedding gift. But we know why Phidias included the battle in his carefully thought-out program of sculptures for the Parthenon. The Centaur-Lapith battle was a very popular theme in the 5th century BC. It and similar mythical scenes were chosen because Athenians could read between the lines. This was a message about their illustrious standing in the world. The Metopes showing battles had a very specific theme close to their hearts. That theme was one of conflict, of man versus beast, order versus chaos, and civilized Greeks versus barbarians. And barbarians meant, to them, the Persians. The Lapiths were the heroic and mythical earliest Greeks. The drunken, loutish, and beastly centaurs were their enemies. Lapith and centaur were shown fighting mano a mano, which made individual Metopes more interesting than a massive, chaotic battle scene. The other sides of the temple had related conflict scenes, Metopes that illustrated scenes from the Trojan War, Greeks fighting Amazons, and Olympian deities fighting giants. Alas, many of them were destroyed in the astonishingly mistreated temple, which was used as a Christian church, a mosque, and finally an ammunition depot, complete with explosions in the centuries following the Golden Age of Greece. But this division of characters into 3 strata, the human, the divine, and the beastly, is made perfectly clear here, and the victors are the Athenians. This series of sculptures, high on the outside of the temple, said very clearly that Athens had come back from its embarrassing defeat by the Persians in 480 BC. It was now at its height in power, treasure, and civilization. So let's examine this Metope now in the British Museum. You see a noble-looking young man completely naked. He's got an athletic and perfect body, just like our athlete, Discobolus. He's straining here, his left leg extended at a diagonal across the centaur's back end, and he seems to lunge and pull away with his now broken but clearly bent right leg. His torso is upright, in contrast to his legs. He's carved as a sculpture that is almost completely in the round. These Metopes defy the fact that they are reliefs. The Lapith extends his arms out horizontally, and his left hand seems to be grasping the centaur's neck as the beast struggles to gallop away from him. Draped over the Lapith's arms and shoulders is an exceptionally beautiful carved draped cloak. It has deep concentric folds. It looks real. You can hardly believe this is hard marble. The cloak forms a sort of backdrop, almost independent of the scene of the battle that's in front of it. It accentuates the drama and the beauty. The human torso has a slightly expanded chest, as if he is about to breathe. The position also forces his torso into an arch that echoes and opposes the even starker bowed line of the centaur's forepart. The muscles on the human are softer and more natural than any we've seen before. They're intrinsic to the body. There's an almost circular shape created by the opposing bodies, and the great thing about a centaur is that his horseback completes this line. You can see the rhythm of opposing forces, of arched and straining muscles embodied in this piece. This is classical Greek rhythm, symmetry, and proportion. You have tension, the movement apart opposed by the clinging forces of the grasping hand. Let's follow the lines. You see that the diagonal line of the Lapith's extended leg echoes the bowing back of the centaur's torso. The drapery echoes the circular forces of motion. There's an equilibrium between the two almost until you notice that the centaur is a little off balance. His back horse legs are bent dramatically. His raised foreleg is a little too short. The beast is rearing up and is more unbalanced. He's losing the fight to the upright and uncompromised Lapith. The Lapith doesn't need to exert himself as much as the beast, whose bent right arm reaches behind his back in a vain effort to disengage the strangling grip of the hero. If you look at this metope from the side, you can see how deep the relief is and how hard it must have been to carve. You can also see how complex it is, with layer upon layer of limbs, drapery, torsos, and so on. So, we're looking at a series of sculptures that were really large, very high off the ground, technically difficult to execute, and sublimely beautiful. If you compare this late metope to what is probably an earlier one with the same theme, you can see a bit of artistic development. This metope shows the same subject, confrontation of Lapith and Centaur. This time they are facing one another. We can see that the faces, lost in the other example, provide quite a contrast here. The Lapith is serene-looking, handsome, similar to the athletes we saw earlier. Centaur, by contrast, is old, grizzled, a bearded man with wild locks, crude features, and the look of a barbarian. The Centaur is trying to strangle the young man, and his diagonal body echoes the angle of his intact arm. You can see that the arms of each figure are a little awkward in their placement. But this is a position that has a great deal of tradition behind it. We see this exact same upwardly angled elbow as early as the Akkadian period in seal impressions of Mesopotamia. In about 2300 BC, Akkadian artists wanted to show hand-to-hand combat, and they hit upon this way of showing it. It proved adequate for thousands of years. The Greeks probably saw images like this and used the same schema for such battle scenes. It makes perfect sense. But then they hit upon their own new way, less awkward, more elegant, the metope you just saw. Imagine the squares of sculptured relief, each metope repeating the figures in conflict, and all this above the columns of the Parthenon. The metopes made a statement about Greek superiority. There's more to the story. Where did these strange centaurs come from? How did they figure out ways to depict these composite creatures? Some people say Mesopotamia, and they're partly right. The Greeks adapted what was useful and what they liked from ideas and images that had been floating around the ancient world for eons, but what they did with them was distinctly different. Remember the Assyrian reliefs and the guardian bullmen? There's some evidence that these images made their way to Greece and were adapted. The notion of a hero who's semi-divine, like the Mesopotamian king Gilgamesh, battling these beasts 2,000 years before the classical age, certainly foreshadows Heracles with his lion battles. What the Greeks did here at the Parthenon, and what they were good at, was taking these stock figures or themes like this battle and making sure they worked on several levels. In effect, they propagandized Greek superiority. Foreigners are beastly and uncivilized, Greeks are not. This is not that far from the pharaoh's role in Egypt of keeping order and deflecting chaos. This sort of propaganda, however, is now seen in a democracy. So rather than having art that glorified a ruler, the art actually glorified the people and the state. It proclaimed their superiority by using images from myths, showing the physical perfection of the Greeks, as well as their ability to conquer those beastly foreigners or giants. As for centaurs themselves, they are an outgrowth of the pervasive idea in the ancient world that there were groups of mythical creatures who were part human and part animal. Just as the Egyptians were good at combining human bodies with, say, a lion head or body, like the Sphinx, the Greeks create creatures who had resonance for them. Horses were a symbol of aristocracy to the Greeks and much desired. They were expensive. The sight of a distant horse and rider probably gave someone the original idea that their identities could be merged. The myths that arose in Greece are varied and colorful, but it's the sculptures that show the Greek skill in making these monstrous creatures believable. So why exactly does the Parthenon show these mythical beasts and battles? Let's go back to why it was built. This period we are discussing was the Golden Age of Greece, the mid-5th century BC. Pericles, the greatest statesman of his time, led Athens, and he called for the building of the Parthenon by the architects Ictinus and Callicrates. Pericles wanted a glorious monument celebrating the comeback of Athens after the traumatic loss to the Persians in the War of 480 BC, when the hated Achaemenid Empire's forces sacked and burnt the Acropolis. Remember the Achaemenids and the 10,000 immortals? They were the soldiers of Persia. And this epic battle between Greeks and Persians reached its denouement right there, high above the city of Athens. Now, the mythic battles take place in marble, high up on the exterior of the Parthenon. Let's look at another set of sculptures. This awkward triangular space is called the pediment. The pediments, too, have a set of sculptures with the theme of conflict on one side and birth in another. It can get a bit cluttered, so this wasn't the greatest space for sculptures, and it required imagination and skill to create sculptures that work together in that space. Unfortunately, most of the sculptures from the pediments were destroyed long ago. A great many of the surviving pedimental sculptures were removed by Lord Elgin. On closer look, it was clear that those sculptures were of almost unimaginable artistic skill. Look at the sensuous wet look of the goddess's drapery here. The languor and the adjustment of positions to the restrictions of the pediment are pure genius. Note how the sculptor has suggested the full sensuousness of the female body without actually depicting a nude figure. The slipping and pooling drapery has expressive meaning on its own, it seems. The use of drapery also gives the whole of the Parthenon sculptures a unifying pattern and design. The brilliance of the carving extends to the horses' heads at the very pinched space in the corners of the pediment. Look at these. These are the chariot horses that draw the moon and sun gods across the sky. They frame the main scene and provide it with a cosmic setting and a narrative based in time and space. At the left is the morning. The horses of Helios, the sun, are energetic and bounding with energy at dawn. The horse of Selene, the moon, is not. This horse head is one of the most famous sculptures from the Parthenon. This horse is weary and exhausted with his journey across the sky. His eyes and veins bulge, his lower lip falls open with exertion, his nostrils flare dangerously. The horse looks as if it could collapse in its harness. The East pediment's theme between these horses was the birth of Athena, but much of the sculpture was lost. The West pediment showed a contest between Athena and Poseidon to become patron god of Athens. We've seen how this alignment of birth and rebirth with dawn in the East was customary in Egypt, and it naturally occurs in the Americas and Asia as well. We'll see it among the Maya in a later lecture. One of the most extraordinary and novel aspects of the Parthenon is this, the continuous inner frieze, which we saw earlier in the Alma Tadema painting. This frieze was an element you would normally see in an Ionic temple, not a Doric one, so the architects and sculptors were playing around with new forms here. The frieze was originally 525 feet long, and it was 40 feet up from the floor, which made it a little hard to see. Now you can see most of what is left of it in the British Museum. Let's go closer. The frieze has one unified theme. This is something that is conceptually quite interesting. We have a procession in honor of Athena that divides in the beginning to make its way on two separate sides, only to join again at the focal point, a frieze in the east. So participants in the actual religious processions walked in the same direction as the carvings above them, so it echoed them. The frieze seems to actually hurry the real people along to its climax. This effect is cleverly achieved by starting with more or less slow and static scenes of preparation. Horses and groomsmen are preparing the steeds by grooming and then harnessing them. The horses are then mounted, and they seem to gather speed as you go along with each section. The horses even rear up, and they start to overlap one another. Their energy and high-spiritedness is quite apparent. They move the file forward in an exciting way. Though this movement seems new, you may remember the standard of Ur, where the war chariots gather momentum as each set of equines leaps and gallops higher than the last. The frieze has an extraordinary rendition of movement, excitement, and narrative. The horses' nervousness and their skittishness is palpable. Their ears are even laid back. Their nostrils are flared. Note that the horses were smaller than our riding horses, and the riders don't use stirrups. They didn't exist in Greece then. The tack of the horses, bridles and reins, is not apparent because they seem to have been added in metal. There are just a few holes where these would have been mounted. A good deal of the frieze is taken up by horses, and they are some of the most beautiful ever created. You can feel their energy in the folds of skin at their shoulders, the prancing gait that erupts into a gallop. Again, horses were beloved by the Greeks. They were expensive and noble, and the sculptors achieved the full range of possibilities of expression in their depictions. This is one of the pinnacles of high classical art. It's interesting to compare this with the narrative scenes we saw in earlier cultures. Remember the Uruk vase almost 3,000 years earlier with its procession of priests, or the standard of Ur with its registers of warriors and chariots, and the Assyrian reliefs, which we know have a carefully thought-out program of narrative in the palaces. And most contemporary with the Greeks, the relentless parade of tribute and Persian soldiers, the immortals. Some believe that the Greeks were consciously imitating the Achaemenid reliefs at Persepolis with their endless marches of tribute bearers, but perhaps differentiating themselves from their arch-enemies. They did this with the depiction of motion, wind fluttering their drapery, and a realistic style that was new and extraordinary. The focal point of the frieze is a scene whose meaning is fraught with controversy. It's the climax of the Pan-Athenaic festival with the folding of the peplos, a garment which was meant to adorn the colossal cult image of Athena housed by the temple. Or was it the mythical founding sacrifice of King Kekrop's daughters? The very perfect and human-looking gods of Olympus look on as this central scene takes place. Arguments about the Parthenon frieze continue, and we may never know this central mystery of the frieze's meaning, but we can certainly appreciate the Greeks' use of mythic allegory here to show their superiority, celebrate their victory over the Persians, and demonstrate their skill in the art of carving marble into narrative. This decoration was extraordinarily costly. Ornamenting the entire building was pure ostentation. We'll end with another extraordinary vignette. Here is just one of the sacrificial animals that marched en route to the temple. This is another astonishing depiction of animals, cows and bulls, all meant for the chopping block of the gods. Remember that Greek religion, too, just like the older religions of the ancient Near East, was based on sacred processions, bloody sacrifice, usually of animals, but occasionally of people, mythical and real. You can see now why the Greek government has been clamoring for the return of these Parthenon marbles. The sculptures are some of the greatest artworks ever created, and they were part of Athens' patrimony. However, the British Museum has countered that it's only their careful curatorship that has saved the marbles from the vagaries of pollution, acid rain, and of course uncertain security. The controversy over whether these masterpieces should be returned to Greece has become an important chess piece in the diplomacy of the modern world. If you can't get to Greece, though, you can still have a Parthenon-like experience in the U.S. Just get yourself to Nashville, where you can see the only full-scale reproduction of the Parthenon. It's made of concrete, and while it's in Nashville's public Centennial Park, not the Acropolis, you'll start to understand the scale and drama of the original. This copy of the Parthenon also has a reconstructed indoor space, and you can go inside it and see a version of the truly colossal statue of the Athena Parthenos with her shield and armor. This 42-foot statue was based on descriptions of the long-lost wonder, an Athena of gold and ivory created by Phidias, and it was recreated by Vanderbilt University graduate Alan LeQuire. You can also see casts of the Parthenon marbles from the British Museum. Next, we will look at a masterpiece of Greek art that shows just one awful death in battle, this time in painting rather than sculpture, but it retains the themes of heroism and myth with an emphasis on suffering and release on an intimate scale.